Do we have free will? It's a question that's almost as divisive as the question, does God exist? So what we can observe is that there are two main camps here. Some people say that we do have at least some kind of freedom of will, some ability to choose. And we can see that this goes very, very far back in history. And it's based on the common experience. Then we have, in the last few decades, maybe in the last 150 years also, we have some people who are denying that we have free will. And in the last few decades, it's based on brain research that shows that there's brain activity several seconds before we consciously make a decision. So we can simply observe that there are two groups of people. They're looking at the same evidence for or against free will, and they reach opposite conclusions. Does that tell us something? Well, it tells me that people can look at the same evidence and reach different conclusions. And how do we explain that unless people have some ability to choose which evidence they consider more real, more convincing? Now, the other question I have is, there are some people who are very, very intent on convincing others that free will is an illusion. But why are they doing this? Why is it so important to them to convince the vast majority of people that we don't have free will? And is it actually logical what they're doing? For example, there's a person named Sam Harris who has been advocating for quite some time now that we don't have free will. In fact, he's written a whole book trying to convince the rest of the people that we don't have free will. And there's even a video on YouTube where he's addressing a group of people, and he's saying that he doesn't believe we have free will because there are unconscious processes in the brain that determine what we do at the conscious level. And yet he is also addressing these people and saying that at the end of this talk, he hopes to convince them that free will is an illusion. So my question there is, if you are saying that I don't have free will because there are unconscious processes in the brain that I don't have any conscious control over that are determining my choices, why are you trying to convince me that you are right? Because wouldn't it follow logically that if I believe I have free will, it's because there are unconscious processes in my brain that gives me this belief? So how am I going to listen to your talk with a conscious mind and consciously override those unconscious processes? In other words, if you really believed that my conscious mind is determined by unconscious processes, why would you try to convince me that free will is an illusion? What faculty do I have that would allow me to consciously change my mind if I don't have free will, or at least some agency, some ability to choose? So I think what we could do as a different approach to this, we could say, okay, we have two camps. Some are absolutely convinced we have free will, some are convinced we don't. They have been arguing for some time. None of them seem to have come up with an ultimate argument that convinces everybody. So perhaps we're asking the wrong question. What if we're asking the wrong question when we ask, do we have free will? And when I look at the debate, it seems to me that there's a kind of an unspoken factor here. And that is that, to me, it seems like there are some people that insist that we have free will. We are completely free to make choices. And there are others that insist that we don't have free will. So is it the word will we should focus on, or the word free? In other words, we could ask a different question. How free is our will? Are there factors that limit our ability to make choices and that might predispose us to make certain choices rather than other choices? In other words, we might have some ability some will, some ability to make certain choices, but they could be very limited by a number of factors. So personally, I think this is a more constructive way to look at the question. So let's look at that. If we go back 500 years in Europe, they had a feudal system. This means that there was a landlord, a nobleman who owned a large piece of land. On this land lived thousands of peasants. They were born into peasant families. These peasants were literally the property of the nobleman. They didn't have a right to move off the land. They didn't have a right to marry without his permission. They couldn't choose their occupation. If you were born to peasant parents, you were going to be a peasant your entire life. You couldn't choose, I want to be a sailor and go explore the world. Simply wasn't possible, at least not without the nobleman's permission. So we could say that back then there were some very clear physical limitations to the options that people had, right? So what we also see today is there are many countries where people have limited options. Russia, China, Iran, many other countries, there are some very physical limitations by the government to what people are allowed to do, what they're allowed to talk about, what they're allowed to publish, and so forth and so on. There are certainly countries in this world where I couldn't make this video because I might be persecuted by the state for saying something different than the official party line. So there are physical limitations to what we can choose. And this means we now have some way to look at free will from a different perspective. It's not a matter of saying we can do anything we want. We need to look at what could we actually do. In other words, what are our options? If we have very few physical options we could choose between, then we don't really have much freedom of will. If you were born as a peasant 500 years ago, you really didn't have much free will. You had very narrow boundaries within you, which you might make choices. You might choose, what you ate for breakfast, or whether you're going to be happy about your lot in life or not happy about your lot in life. But you had very few physical options to choose from. So there's certainly physical limitations to our freedom of will. But in many nations today, the modern democracies, we have a far greater freedom of will. But we still can have limitations to our ability to choose. I've said before in my videos that I grew up in a working class family in Denmark. And in my family, the attitude to life was, you get a job. You might get an education to get a better job, but you get a job. You don't start your own business. Nobody even thought about starting your own business. It was simply not something that was ever talked about as I was growing up. So you could say that if I had believed in everything that I was told as I was growing up, I would have adopted this mindset, I have to get a job. And I would never have thought about becoming a writer and starting my own publishing company and so forth. So you can say that there's a certain cultural influence that we are sort of brought up, we are programmed to see ourselves in a certain way. In other words, wherever we grow up on the planet, there's a certain sense of identity we are brought up with. Who are we? What kind of people are we? What does it mean to be a human being in our environment? And you can see many areas of the world where people are brought up in deep poverty, and many people accept that this is all my life can be. I couldn't improve my life beyond these limitations. But here's the interesting part about this. Where are these limitations located? They're located in our minds, in our psyches. Right? There are no, as I grew up in Denmark, there were no physical limitations that prevented me from starting a business. It was only a psychological limitation. So to me, the most interesting question about free will actually is, how do our own minds limit our freedom to choose? What are the psychological factors in our minds that are limiting our freedom of choice? And the reason why this is interesting to me is that I've always had a very practical approach to life. I've always accepted there are certain things I can't change. I can't change the force of gravity. So why should I protest or rebel against the force of gravity? I just accept it and make the best of it. And likewise, there are certain limitations I can't necessarily change personally, in the short term at least, so I accept those and make the best of it. And that has led me to an attitude where I have said, okay, so there are certain physical limitations that I can't personally change. What can I change? Well, I can change my psychological limitations. I can do something about my own psychology, my own mind, my own state of mind. And this caused me, at the age of 18, to discover that there's an alternative to what we call ordinary living. And I talked about it before in some of my other videos. My family, basically, if you look at them, by the time they reached early adulthood, when they were 18, 20 years old, for most of them, their psychology, their attitude to life was pretty much set. Most of my family members, by the time they reached adulthood, they had adapted a certain attitude to life, what they could and what they couldn't do. They had a certain psychology that caused them to react a certain way to life, and they still do this 30, 40, 50 years later. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it, I'm just saying this is the common experience. But in this common life experience, how much freedom of choice do people have? Basically, if you look at many, many people out there, you will see that when they're exposed to a particular situation, they're not making a conscious choice. How do I want to respond to that situation? There is an unconscious process that causes to respond the same way today as they've done in the past. I have in some of my other videos talked about a child is bullied at the age of 5. It adopts a certain reaction to being bullied, which means it becomes passive, feels disempowered, and doesn't think it can stand up for itself. And now that child reaches adulthood, is in its 30s, it gets a new job, and there's a person on that new job that's bullying that person. And the reactionary pattern that was created by the age of 5 is now triggered, which means that a person in his or her 30s is now responding the same way as it did when it was 5 years old. An adult is responding as a 5-year-old to a situation of being bullied. Because the adult doesn't have enough conscious awareness to choose a different reaction. It's allowing this subconscious reactionary pattern, which I also call a subconscious self, to choose for it, to choose its reaction. So in other words, it's not actually acting in a situation, it's reacting. And when we look at most people, we can see that most of the things they do during their lives is reactions. They had certain patterns that were created in the past, and they are just repeating those patterns. New situations come up, they trigger a certain pattern, they react that way. So they are reacting their whole lives. Is this freedom of choice? I don't really think so. So what I discovered when I was 18 years old was that there is an alternative to this approach to life. And it is that we human beings actually have the ability to step outside of ourselves, outside of our own minds. I'm talking mentally, step outside, look at ourselves and say, why am I reacting this way? Is this really the way I want to react? Do I really want to react as an adult the way I reacted as a 5-year-old? Or do I want to take command over my psychology, over my reactionary patterns, and choose how I react or act in a particular situation? And what I discovered at the age of 18 was that this has always been an option for human beings. Now, 99% of people have never discovered this as an option. Why? Because we are brought up, we are programmed to think. We don't have an option. We just have to react the way we reacted in the past, the way we saw our parents react, the way we saw the adults in our society react. We have to react the way we were programmed to think a human being has to react. So most people have been brought up and they have accepted this passive approach to life. All I can do in life is react. React based on the past, based on other people's reaction, based on my culture. And what I discovered is there's an alternative to this, and it's been there for thousands of years, and for thousands of years, a few people in every generation have found it. They have discovered it. They have discovered there is a systematic path whereby we can examine our reactions, and we can consciously come to see them, and we can consciously come to change them. And so what we can say is, going back to the question, do we have free will? That depends on how conscious we are. 99% of the people on the planet have very limited freedom of choice because they're not very conscious of their own psychology, their own subconscious reactions. So they are just reacting based on these subconscious patterns that are programmed into the subconscious mind. But it is possible to become conscious of this and thereby come to a point where you can choose your reactions. I talk in some of my breakthrough videos about how we can follow this systematic path where we come to see these reactionary patterns, which are really cells in our subconscious mind. We can separate ourselves from them, we can overcome them, and therefore, as we go towards a point where we have less and less of these subconscious patterns, our will becomes more and more free. So what we can say is, most human beings are taking a passive approach to the freedom of will. They have allowed their freedom of will to be limited, perhaps even severely limited, and they are not doing anything about it. But there are people, and there's a growing number of people in today's world, who are taking an active approach. They are saying, I'm not going to be bound by these reactionary patterns that were programmed into my mind in the past. I am going to look at this, I'm going to take command over it, and these people are proving that it is possible for us to consciously, systematically increase our freedom of choice, our freedom to make choices. So, do we have free will? How free is our will? Well, we have an ability to make choices. That's why some people think we have free will and some people don't. But for most people, it's very severely limited, but it is possible to free it up. Can you come to a point where you are completely free? Well, that is what a few people have proven. They have demonstrated that as you continue to walk on this path that increases your psychological freedom, you can reach a point where you're completely free. You are making choices that are not a programmed response, that are not limited by outer conditions. You can make a very, very free choice. Perhaps not completely free because, as I said, we live on a planet where there's gravity. No matter what level of consciousness you reach, you can't just choose to float off in the air because your physical body is bound by gravity. But the question is, are those physical conditions really a limitation of our freedom of choice? Because how are we making choices? We are making choices in a certain environment. So, in other words, there are those people who will say, well, we only have free will if we can do anything we want. But that's kind of a logical fallacy, because how do you make a choice? Let's say that I'm walking down the road in a forest. The path divides. I could go right, I can go left. If I go right, the path goes through the forest, all I see is trees, and then after a kilometer, it joins up with the other path. If I go left, I walk through the forest, all I see is trees, and after a kilometer, I join the other path. So, in other words, I can choose, do I go right or do I go left, but I end up in the same place. And I see the same, whether I go this way or that way. So, have I really made a choice? Well, yes, I made a choice, but there's no difference in the consequence. The ultimate outcome is the same. So what I'm saying is that we actually only make choices when we have at least two options that lead to different consequences, different outcomes. That's when we have a choice. we have two options, they lead to different outcomes. If we have two options, they lead to the same outcome, we don't really have a choice, right? So what is it that determines the outcome of our choices? Well, it's the circumstances, the physical circumstances we find ourselves in. So we live on planet Earth, there are certain physical conditions here, and we are choosing within that framework. So we don't have the ability to do anything we want, but we have a certain freedom within the circumstances we find ourselves in. Why is that important? Because if you take my other videos, especially my series about how the world works, you will see that what I explain in there is that there is actually a purpose to life. There is actually a purpose to the existence of the physical world. And that purpose is our growth in consciousness. So, in other words, how do we grow? What I have said is we are co-creators. We are self-aware beings. We make choices in a certain environment, and by seeing the consequences of the choices we make, we can realize, why did I experience that consequence? Well, because I made a choice, but why did I make the choice? Because of my psychology. My psychological makeup at this particular time was what caused me to make that choice. I now see the consequence of that choice. I don't like the consequences. I don't want more of those consequences. So how do I avoid having the same consequences again? By looking at my psychology, saying, why did I make that choice? What was the psychological mechanism in me? And then you consciously change that mechanism. You change your psychological makeup. And so this is the entire purpose of life, is that we have the potential to be on this conscious path of raising our state of mind, our state of consciousness, our sense of awareness. This is the entire purpose of life, as I explained in one of my other videos. So, when you realize that, you realize that we are given a certain choice. We are given the ability to make choices. But our choices, the choices we can see, the choices we think we can make, are limited by our psychology, by our psychological makeup. But our psychological makeup is something we can take control over. We can change it. We can consciously change it. So you can say, we take a certain person. Right now, this person has a certain psychological makeup. This means that this person, if exposed to a particular situation, is very likely to do the same that the person has done in the past. In other words, the person is likely to not make a free choice, what do I do in this situation, but to go into a programmed reaction that comes from the subconscious mind. So from this point you can say, does the person have free will in that particular situation? And in many cases, for most people on earth, we would say no. They don't actually have free will, because they're not choosing, they're just reacting. But does that mean that free will is an illusion, that free will doesn't exist? No, because the person, even though it has no free will at the present, it has the potential to step back, look at itself and say, I don't want to continue to react that way. I want to be able to choose a different reaction. And a person then has the ability to change its psychological makeup and to do this consciously. So the ability to change your life has been proven in practical life by millions and millions of people. There are more and more people in today's world that are waking up saying, I don't want to be a slave of my psychology from the past. I want to take command over my own psychology and choose a new direction for my life. And millions of people are proving that this is possible. So for me, the question really isn't, do we have free will in some ultimate way? But the question is, do we have freedom of will in a practical way? How free is our will? How free is your will? How free are you willing to make it? To me, that's the interesting question. The academics of ultimate free will or not free will are not that interesting to me, because I have always had a practical approach to life. What can I do to improve my life? And if you come and tell me there's nothing you can do to improve your life, I'll have to say, I just don't accept that. I never have accepted it, and I never will, because I have proven that it's wrong. You may not have proven that it's wrong, but that's because you are still allowing your psychological reactions to be taken over by subconscious programs. So you may be right that you don't have free will, but I do. I do have a much greater freedom of will today than I had when I started this path 47 years ago. I am much more free to choose my actions and my reactions. I have fewer and fewer reactions. And it's not about me. Many, many people have proven the same thing. Millions of people have proven you can walk a systematic path where you can increase your freedom of choice. To me, that is the interesting answer to the question, do we have free will?